A former Navy SEAL entered a snowy village market where something beside an old tool table stopped him cold. A 6-year-old German Shepherd lay beneath a sign reading, "Sell $10, ignoring every buyer who passed. The dog kept staring toward one road east, as if the person he belonged to was still somewhere there. The next morning, that road led the Navy SEAL to an elderly veteran the dog had never stopped waiting for. Inside the old man's home were packed boxes, priced tools, and a foreclosure notice with only weeks left. Then surveyors returned, and the veteran revealed they did not really want his house. They needed the land behind it. Stay to the end, and like and subscribe for more journeys of loyalty, healing, and second chances. By the last week of November, snow had settled over Ashwick Hollow, a small mountain village tucked between pine ridges in the American North. It softened the roofs, filled the roadside ditches, and made every engine trouble feel a little more urgent. Dane Corbett had been working since sunrise. At 51, the former Navy SEAL repaired the ordinary machines that kept Ashwick Hollow moving through winter. Generators, tow rigs, snowblowers, old tractors, anything that could leave a family cold or stranded when it quit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and still built like a man who had spent years expecting his body to do difficult things. These days, his hands carried more grease than anything else. People trusted Dane to show up when something broke. They knew less about what happened after he went home alone. Years earlier, Dane had lost the closest friend of his military life. Since then, he had become careful with promises. He trusted bolts, belts, voltage, weather reports, things that could be checked. The future was harder. That morning, after repairing the backup generator behind Ashwick General Store, Dane checked the volunteer road crew's snow tow. He still needed a replacement drive belt for a snowblower waiting in his garage, which was why he crossed the village's final outdoor market of the season. A widow named Ruth Carver caught him before he reached it. "My heater's knocking again," Mrs. Carver said. "Could you come by next Thursday?" Dane wiped his hands on the gray shop rag hanging from his back pocket. "I'll see what I can do." Mrs. Carver gave him a patient look. "You always say that." Dane picked up his toolbox. "Then I've been consistent." She laughed once. "That is not the same as dependable." Dane almost argued. Instead, he gave her a small nod and walked on. The market stood beside the old fire hall under canvas awnings heavy with snow. There were jars of preserves, work coats, lanterns, hand tools, cracked furniture, and enough rusted machine parts to keep Dane interested for an hour. He made it 12 minutes. Then he saw the German Shepherd. The dog lay beside a table covered with saw blades and old clamps. A brown leather leash had been looped around one table leg. Beside the dog stood a piece of cardboard with 2 lines written in black marker. "Sell, $10." Dane stopped. The Shepherd was a 6-year-old male, black and tan, large without being bulky. A dark saddle covered most of his back, while warm copper-gold fur marked his legs and lower chest. His right ear stood straight. The tip of his left leaned slightly outward. His amber hazel eyes were alert, but they were not watching buyers. A woman walked past carrying sausage wrapped in paper. The dog barely looked at her. A boy crouched several feet away and clicked his tongue. Nothing. Every few moments, the Shepherd turned his head toward the same place, the Eastern Road. Dane followed the dog's gaze. Nothing was coming. Behind the table stood Lyle Denton, a 68-year-old handyman Dane knew from around town. Lyle had short gray hair, a weathered canvas vest, and a dark red thermos planted beside one boot. Dane pointed at the cardboard. $10? Lyle's mouth tightened. That's what I was told to ask. Not what he was asking, what he had been told. Dane looked back at the dog. "What's his name?" "Boone." Lyle reached down and rubbed one hand along the Shepherd's neck. Boone accepted it without taking his eyes off the road. "He belongs to Otis Renner." Dane knew Otis Renner as a 78-year-old retired mechanic and veteran who lived on the eastern slope above Hollow Crest Road. Dane had repaired a starter for him years before. They were not friends, but Ashwick Hollow was small enough that a man could know someone's truck before he knew his favorite story. Why is Otis selling him? Lyle glanced toward Boone before answering. He's not sure he can give him a home much longer. Dane waited. Lyle did not add anything. So where's Otis going? The older man slowly twisted the lid of his thermos. Otis asked me to find Boone a good home. That wasn't my question. Lyle met Dane's eyes. No. A beat passed. It wasn't. He left it there. Dane had spent enough years around men who carried private burdens to know when another question would only make them close the door harder. He took a $10 bill from his wallet. Lyle looked at it. You planning to think about this first? I just did. For how long? Dane handed over the bill. Long enough to spend $10. That earned the faintest smile from Lyle. He crouched and untied the leash. Go on, Boone. The shepherd rose. For several seconds, Boone stayed beside Lyle. Then he looked east again. Only after that did he approach Dane. It was a small thing. Still, Dane noticed. The dog did not look grateful. He looked unfinished. Dane found the snowblower belt 20 minutes later and drove home with Boone sitting upright on the passenger side of his old pickup. His house stood beside a detached garage on the western edge of Ashwick Hollow. Smoke came from the chimney. Firewood was stacked square beneath the eaves. Inside the garage, tools hung where they belonged. Nothing looked abandoned. Loneliness rarely needed broken windows. Sometimes it kept good records. Dane filled a metal bowl with water, then found food he kept for the occasional farm dog that wandered onto the property. Boone approached, stopped, and looked at him. Dane frowned. You waiting for paperwork? Boone remained still. Eat. Only then did the shepherd lower his head. Dane watched for another moment. That kind of patience came from somewhere, but this was not a mystery he needed to solve. Not yet. He went back to the garage. By late afternoon, the snowblower was running again. Dane carried the repaired housing outside, tested it once, then shut it down before the noise could annoy half the valley. When he returned to the house, Boone was lying beside the eastern window. Same place as before. Dane set his gloves on the counter. You've got the whole house. Boone lifted one ear. You picked the worst view. The dog turned his head toward the road. That answered more than a bark would have. After dark, headlights appeared below the ridge. An old pickup climbed the eastern road. Boone stood immediately. No whining, no scratching at the door. He moved close to the glass and watched. The truck climbed higher. Its taillights became two red points between the trees. Then they vanished. Boone remained there. Dane leaned one shoulder against the kitchen doorway. For most of the day, he had been thinking of Boone as a dog brought into a new house. Now the mistake was obvious. Boone had learned the water bowl, the food, the rooms. But none of those things had become the center of his attention. The road had. Dane looked at the German shepherd. You're not waiting to settle in. Boone glanced toward him, then back east. Dane exhaled through his nose. No. You're waiting to go back. The next morning, he opened the passenger door of the pickup. Come on. Boone climbed in before Dane reached for the leash. Fresh snow covered the village road. As they drove east, Boone sat quietly, but his posture changed with every mile. His head rose. His nose worked whenever cold air came through the cracked window. Dane noticed all of it. He turned onto a narrow road beneath tall pines. Boone stood. At the end sat an old cedar-sided house below a snowy slope. Behind it, Dane could see the top of a retaining wall and several bright orange survey stakes planted farther across the property. A man stood on the porch. Otis Renner looked smaller than Dane remembered, though not frail. White hair showed beneath a wool cap. A short white mustache framed a mouth that seemed accustomed to holding back more than it said. One hand rested on the railing. Dane stopped the truck. Boone waited for the door. Then he jumped down. Dane expected a run. Instead, the German Shepherd walked. Slowly. The last few yards seemed to deserve more care than the first 100 miles. Otis did not call him. He lowered one hand. Boone climbed the porch steps, pushed his head beneath that hand, and sat against the old man's leg. Otis's fingers disappeared into the thick fur behind Boone's ear. Then Otis turned his face toward the white pines. No speech, no apology, no dramatic reunion. Just an old man trying not to let another man see his eyes. Dane looked away first. There were moments a decent person did not improve by staring at them. Still, one truth had become impossible to ignore. No one sold a dog loved like that, because $10 mattered. Indeed, the explanation had already begun before Otis spoke. Cardboard boxes lined the wall. Several mechanics' tools carried handwritten price tags. 2 framed photographs had been wrapped in towels. On the kitchen table lay an official envelope. Dane did not touch it. The word in the window was enough. Foreclosure. Otis filled a kettle. Coffee. Dane kept looking at the envelope. How long? Otis stopped pouring water. 3 weeks. Maybe less. Dane glanced toward Boone, already lying beside Otis's chair, as if the previous day had been an unwanted detour. You sold Boone before you lost the house. Otis set the kettle down. I wanted to know he had one. That answer landed harder than Dane expected. He looked around at the packed boxes. How much to get current? Otis's expression changed. Dane continued before the older man could answer. Tell me the number. If I can cover it, we settle the rest later. Otis shook his head. No. Pride is expensive. So is taking over a man's life and calling it kindness. Dane went still. Otis did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The old man rested one hand on the back of the chair. I need help, Dane. I know that. He looked directly at him. I don't need someone taking the decisions out of my hands because they can. For years, Dane had believed capability created obligation. If he could carry the weight, he carried it. If he could repair the problem, he repaired it. There had been a time when that belief kept people alive. There had also been a cost. His fingers found the small steel feeler gauge in his pocket, the old tool he had carried longer than he cared to explain. Dane released it. Your house, he said. Your decision. Otis watched him. If I ask? I help. A quiet nod passed between them. Not friendship. Not yet. But perhaps the first honest agreement either man had made that morning. Then tires crunched outside. Boone was on his feet before Dane reached the window. A dark SUV, marked North Crest Development Group, had stopped beside the property. 2 survey workers stepped out with measuring equipment and bright orange stakes. Otis's shoulders tightened. Barely. Boone saw it. The shepherd moved onto the porch as one of the workers headed toward the rear property line. Boone stepped down into the snow and stopped between the men and Otis. No growl. No charge. Just a steady body planted where it believed it belonged. One surveyor slowed. Otis placed a hand on Boone's neck. Easy. The dog held still. Otis looked toward the workers. They've been here before. Dane noticed the older orange stakes already scattered beyond them. How many times? Otis's gaze stayed on the snowy ground. More than I gave permission for. The answer changed the shape of the problem. The foreclosure was no longer just a bill Otis could not pay. Someone had already been treating his land as if the decision were moving on without him. Dane looked beyond the workers toward the slope rising behind the house. So, Northcrest wants this place. Otis shook his head. No. For the first time, the exhaustion left his face. Something sharper replaced it. He looked beyond the retaining wall, toward the white ridge behind his home. They need what's behind it. They need what's behind it. Otis Renner left the sentence there. Beyond the porch, the two North Crest survey workers had stopped near the orange stakes. Boone remained in the snow between them and the house, calm but alert, while Dane Corbett studied the slope rising behind the property. From the porch, it looked ordinary enough. Pines. Rock. A narrow strip of winter-brown brush showing through the snow. But Dane had spent enough years fixing machinery to distrust anything described as ordinary before somebody opened the cover. He looked back at Otis. "Show me." Otis did not answer immediately. That mattered. The day before, Dane might have already been halfway down the steps. Now he waited. Otis glanced at him, perhaps noticing the difference. Then the old man reached for his barn coat. "All right." The North Crest crew did not continue after Otis told them they had no permission to set new stakes that morning. They collected their equipment and returned to the SUV without argument. One of the men said the office would follow up. Otis answered, "The office has my number." Boone watched the vehicle until it disappeared down the road. Only then did he turn back toward the house. Dane noticed that too. They started behind the property a few minutes later. The retaining wall came into full view once they passed the garage. It was larger than Dane expected. Stone-filled concrete sections stepped along the slope for nearly 100 feet, reinforced at the base and tied into drainage channels that carried runoff away from the house. Snow lay across the top in a clean white line. Dane crouched near one drainage outlet. This wasn't cheap. Otis stood above him. "No." How bad was the slide? "Bad enough to wake me before sunrise." 2 years earlier, Otis explained. 3 days of warm rain had loosened the upper slope. A section of earth shifted behind the house, pushing mud and stone toward the lower bank. The house had survived. The ground behind it had not looked trustworthy afterward. An engineer recommended a retaining system before the next freeze-thaw season. Otis had taken out an emergency property repair loan and started work. Dane ran one hand along the concrete edge. "You built part of this yourself." Otis gave him a sideways look. "I was 76, not dead." Dane almost smiled. "I meant the finish." "That better be what you meant." The exchange broke some of the stiffness between them. Then Dane looked downhill. Through the bare trunks below, a narrow paved road curved beneath the property. He recognized it. Hollow Crest Road. A county plow had passed sometime before dawn, leaving 2 dark tire lines through the snow. Dane stood. "That road's directly under the wall." Otis nodded. "The East Clinic route." Ashwick Community Clinic sat farther down the valley. In summer, drivers had more than one way to reach it. Winter narrowed the choices. Hollow Crest Road was the dependable approach from the eastern side of the village, especially when snow closed the higher back route. Dane looked from the wall to the road. So when the hill moved, the road was at risk too. Otis said it without pride. That bothered Dane more than if the old man had bragged. "How much did the county pay toward this?" Otis brushed snow from the top of one concrete section. "Nothing." Dane looked at him. "Why?" "Because I didn't wait long enough to ask properly." That answer sounded familiar. Otis explained that the slide happened late in the season. County crews inspected the road quickly, but funding for private slope stabilization required review, cost-sharing questions, and meetings. Winter was coming. The ground was already moving. Otis had received an estimate, signed the loan, and started the work. Dane folded his arms. "You could have waited." Otis looked downhill at Hollow Crest Road. So could the snow. For a moment, neither man spoke. A vehicle from the clinic passed below them, moving carefully through the bend. A blue medical emblem showed on the door before the trees hid it again. Dane watched it go. The debt had changed shape. It was still Otis's name on the loan, Still Otis's house at risk, but part of the money had held a road used by people who might never know his name. Dane thought about how many times a community depended on things no one noticed until they failed. A generator, a culvert, a retaining wall, an old man who decided not to wait. There were people who spoke about service as if it required a uniform. God had made use of quieter hands too. Dane looked at Otis. "You should have told somebody." Otis raised one white eyebrow. "You offering that advice?" The question landed cleanly. Dane looked away first. "Fair." Otis gave the smallest hint of a smile. That was when Dane understood something he did not particularly enjoy. He and Otis were not opposites. They were variations of the same bad habit. See the problem. Carry the problem. Tell nobody until the weight becomes part of your posture. The difference was that Dane had spent years calling the habit responsibility. They went back inside, where Otis brought out the loan papers from a kitchen drawer. He did not hand them over immediately. "Read what I ask you to read." Dane nodded. "Your decision." Otis placed the packet on the table. The original emergency property repair loan was not mysterious. The principal, interest, payment schedule, and late payment terms were all printed clearly. The trouble came later. A pension check did not grow because propane cost more. Neither did it grow when property taxes rose. Otis missed payments, then caught up, then missed another. The loan was transferred for servicing to Granite Crown Finance, a regional company that handled distressed and higher-risk property accounts. The original principal did not suddenly change. Neither did the contractual interest rate. What grew were the things around it. Late charges, servicing fees allowed under the agreement, legal notices, foreclosure-related costs once the account remained behind long enough. None looked ruinous by itself. Together, they became a staircase Otis had to climb while someone kept adding steps. Dane put down the latest statement. "How far behind?" "Far enough. That isn't a number. It's the number I'm giving you today." Dane almost pushed, then remembered yesterday. He sat back. Otis noticed. Again. Progress, Dane was discovering, could look a lot like keeping your mouth shut. On the table beside the loan packet lay a folded Northcrest brochure. Dane opened it only after Otis nodded. The proposed Northcrest Lodge occupied a broad section of the northern ridge. Cabins, a main lodge, service buildings, winter trails. 2 possible service road lines appeared on an older planning map Otis had kept. One route curved west around a rocky ravine. The other approached through the land behind Otis's house. Dane traced the western route. "Why not this?" "Rock cut." Otis pointed farther north. "And a bridge over the ravine." "Expensive. That tends to offend developers." Dane studied the second line. It crossed the upper portion of Otis's parcel, then bent toward the ridge. Lower down, another shaded strip followed the creek. "What's this?" Otis frowned. "Old protected strip." "You own it." "I own the land." "That wasn't what I asked." Otis looked at him. For the first time, uncertainty entered his expression. "There are restrictions. Old ones." "From when?" "Long enough ago that I'd rather not guess." That was not enough information to solve anything, but it was enough to make the map more interesting. Northcrest did not simply need Otis's front porch or kitchen. The upper section of his parcel gave them the cheaper approach to the ridge. The lower creek strip carried some older land use restriction. Owning the house would not magically remove that restriction, whatever it was, but control of the parcel would put Northcrest in a much stronger position over the unprotected upper section and give them a seat in any future process involving the restricted strip. Dane folded the map carefully. "So, this isn't about buying a house." Otis looked toward the rear window. "No. It's about controlling the approach." "That's closer." Dane glanced at the Granite Crown statement again. Another question surfaced. Why did Granite Crown buy this loan? Otis shrugged. They service thousands. That was true enough. Later that afternoon, Dane used the public business database at his garage computer. He did not dig into private accounts or play investigator. He only followed corporate filings anyone could read. Granite Crown was not owned by Gavin Kress, the man directing North Crest Development Group. But the connection was not imaginary either. A private investment fund, providing major financing to North Crest Lodge, also held a controlling interest in Granite Crown. Legal. Public. Possibly meaningless. Dane stared at the screen. Those were three different things. He wrote the company names on a yellow shop pad, but made no accusation. A relationship was not proof of a plan. Still, the loan against Otis's land and the resort that wanted access across that same land were no longer strangers. That evening, Boone began paying attention to something else. Dane had returned to Otis's property to help replace a loose weather strip on the garage door. Boone had stayed near them most of the afternoon. Then the German Shepherd wandered toward the rear fence. He stopped. Beyond it, almost hidden beneath snow and brush, was an old footpath running toward the creek. Otis called him back. "Boone." The dog looked over his shoulder, then returned. Nothing more happened. The next day, Boone did it again. This time, Dane did not follow. He looked at Otis. "The path." Otis's face changed. Not fear. Something quieter. Miriam used to walk that way. It was the first time Dane had heard the name spoken. Miriam Sloan Renner had been Otis's wife. She had died 6 years earlier. Nearly every evening, weather permitting, Miriam had followed the creek trail after supper. Boone had often gone with her. Dane looked toward the waiting dog. So he remembers. Better than I do some days. Otis's voice was gentle rather than ashamed. Boone remained at the beginning of the path, waiting. Dane could have walked down it alone in 5 minutes. Instead, he asked, "Do you want to see where he's going?" Otis studied him. That question mattered too. After a moment, the old man reached for his coat. "Yes." They followed Boone beneath the pines. The path was uneven, but still visible under the snow. Boone moved ahead, then stopped every 20 or 30 yards and looked back until Otis caught up. He did not pull. He did not disappear around the bends. He remembered the route, but he remembered the man behind him too. The creek ran dark between shelves of snow. After 15 minutes, the path opened into a small clearing. An old wooden bench stood beneath a pine, its seat covered in white. Boone walked directly to it, then sat. Otis stopped several feet away. For a while, he did not move. Dane understood enough not to fill the silence. Finally, Otis brushed snow from one end of the bench. "My wife liked this place because nobody had improved it." Dane looked around. "That sounds expensive for a developer." Otis gave a soft, surprised laugh. "Miriam would have liked you less than Boone does. Most people do." The laugh faded, but the warmth of it remained. Dane crouched beside the bench and cleared snow from a small bronze plaque fixed to the backrest. The letters emerged slowly. In memory of Miriam Sloan Renner, Otis stared at the middle name. Not the first, not the last. Sloan. His expression tightened. Dane stood. "What?" Otis touched the plaque with 2 fingers. "Miriam handled some of the creek paperwork years ago." Dane waited. Otis looked toward the water, then back at the name. "When we searched old property records after North Crest first approached me, everything was under Renner." "And?" Otis kept looking at the plaque. Miriam didn't always file under Renner. The cold seemed to sharpen around them. Boone sat quietly beside the bench where he had once waited for Miriam. Otis lowered his hand. "Maybe we've been looking under the wrong name." The name on the bronze plaque did not change. Miriam Sloan Renner. But the way Otis looked at it did. Boone remained beside the memorial bench, his dark back dusted with fine snow. Dane Corbett stood a few feet away and watched Otis trace the word Sloan with one gloved finger. For 6 years, that had been part of his wife's name. Now it was also a direction. By 9 the next morning, Dane and Otis were climbing the stone steps of the old county records annex at the lower end of Ashwick Hollow. Boone came with them, but stayed in the heated entry area beside Otis's chair once they were told dogs could not enter the archive room. He settled without complaint, old brown collar visible against the gold fur of his neck. The woman waiting beyond the glass door was Della Ames, 73, a retired county land records clerk who had spent nearly 4 decades teaching other people that paperwork was only boring until it mattered. Della was small, silver-haired, and dressed in a dusty blue cardigan over a cream blouse. Reading glasses hung from a thin cord around her neck. A mechanical pencil was already in one hand. She looked at Dane first. "You the muscle?" Dane glanced at Otis. "I was hoping for research assistant." Della considered that. "You have the face for lifting boxes." Otis almost smiled. That alone made the trip worthwhile. Della led them past newer computer terminals into a back room where older deed books, microfilm indexes, survey maps, and scanned records had been preserved through several generations of county systems. She did not begin by asking what conspiracy they suspected. She asked what name they had searched. "Renner," Otis said. "First mistake." Otis frowned. Della lifted one hand before he could object. "Not your mistake. The system's." She explained that older land records had not always followed a person neatly from one legal name to another. Some indexes used the name written on the original filing. Others had been digitized decades later by clerks working from incomplete cross-references. Miriam had been Miriam Sloan on several early property-related documents. Della typed the name slowly. Miriam Sloan. Then she searched. 3 results appeared. Otis leaned forward. Dane did not. He watched Otis instead. The old man's expression changed before Della opened anything. There was something unsettling about finding new evidence of a person who had been gone 6 years. Grief usually taught a man to expect less, not more. Della opened the first scan. Drainage agreement. Not it. The second concerned an old survey correction. Then she clicked the third. The header filled the screen. Conservation and community access easement. Otis sat very still. Della read the indexing information, then turned toward him. 27 years ago. Otis shook his head once. "I remember paperwork along the creek. I don't remember calling it that." "That's why God made clerks," Della said. "Nobody remembers the names we give things." Dane pulled a chair closer. The document covered the narrow creek corridor below the upper portion of the Renner property, the same strip that had appeared shaded on Northcrest's older planning map. Miriam and Otis had granted the easement to the Ashwick Land Conservancy, a small local land trust organization created years earlier to preserve creek corridors and public green space. The agreement also protected limited county maintenance access near the lower portion connected to Hollow Crest Road. Dane read the operative section twice. "This stays with the land?" "Yes," Della said. "So selling the house doesn't erase it?" "No." Otis looked between them. "What does erase it?" Della's pencil stopped. "That is a much better question." She found the amendment section. The terms were clear enough once she translated the legal language. Otis, as current property owner, could not simply release the easement. Neither could Northcrest if it bought the land. A significant relocation or amendment required agreement from the property owner, approval from Ashwick Land Conservancy, and County Land Use Review. Dane sat back. For the first time since he had seen the foreclosure envelope, one possibility disappeared. Gavin Kress could not simply acquire Otis's house and draw a road wherever he wanted. That should have felt like good news. Instead, it made another question heavier. If Northcrest knew that, why had survey crews already been treating the land as though the road were possible? Della was turning pages when she stopped. "There's a cover letter." Otis looked up. "From who?" Della rotated the screen. "Your wife." The letter was only one page. No dramatic confession, no hidden warning. It had been submitted with the easement documents 27 years earlier. Miriam's language was practical. She wrote about creek access, erosion, future development, and why leaving the corridor undeveloped mattered to the road and the people who used it. Near the bottom was one paragraph. Della read silently, then moved aside so Otis could see. Dane watched his eyes stop on one sentence. "Someday someone may call this strip useless because nothing has been built on it. Please remember that leaving a place open can also be a public use." Otis made a small sound through his nose. Not quite laughter. Not quite sorrow. "That's Miriam." Dane looked at him. "Sounds stubborn." She was polite about it. That can be worse. This time Otis did laugh. It came softly and disappeared quickly, but the room felt warmer after it. For a moment, Miriam was not a name on a memorial plaque. She was a woman at a kitchen table 27 years earlier, filling out forms because she believed an empty piece of land could still serve people. Dane thought of the old feeler gauge in his own pocket. Some people left monuments, others left tools. Miriam had left a line on a map that still had work to do. Della closed the cover letter. Now we know what exists. She tapped her pencil once against the desk. We still don't know what Northcrest thinks exists. That changed the room again. Della opened the county's current Northcrest Lodge permit file. The application was thick enough to discourage anyone who did not have a reason to keep reading. Site maps, drainage studies, road profiles, ownership tables, survey access forms. Dane felt his patience thinning within 6 minutes. Della noticed. "You repair engines?" "Yes." "Imagine every page is a bolt. That makes this worse." "Good. Then you'll stay awake." Otis looked down to hide another smile. Della searched the file for the creek parcel. The conservation easement appeared. Clearly. Northcrest had not hidden it. They had not claimed it was terminated either. Dane frowned. "So they know about it." "They have to," Della said. She kept reading. Then her hand stopped over the mouse. There was an attachment beneath the road access section. Owner consent to easement, relocation, and temporary survey access. Della opened it. The document did not erase the easement. Instead, it stated that the current property owner consented to deeper survey work on the parcel, authorized Northcrest to begin discussions with Ashwick Land Conservancy about relocating part of the protected corridor, and acknowledged that the upper portion of the property could be considered for a future road approach if permits were approved. Dane understood immediately why it mattered. It was not the final permission, but it opened doors. It gave Northcrest something to point to when the survey crews arrived. It told officials that the owner was cooperating. Dane turned toward Otis. "When did you agree to this?" Otis did not answer. His eyes had moved to the bottom of the page. Dane followed them. There was a signature. Otis Renner. Below it sat a notary seal. Della zoomed in. No one spoke for several seconds. Otis leaned closer. "That's my name." Dane waited. Otis's voice lowered. "That is not my signature." The statement landed differently from everything that had come before. The loan could be explained. The fees could be explained. Even Northcrest's pressure could be explained by money. But a document said Otis had agreed to something he was now saying he had never agreed to. Dane felt his body move toward the old solution before his mind caught up. "Find Gavin. Ask directly. Do not let somebody hide behind paper." He reached for his phone. Otis put one hand over it. No. Dane looked at him. We should call Cress. No. He's using your name. And if someone used it once, I want to know how many places they used it before we tell them we noticed. Dane studied the older man. There was no helplessness in Otis now. The man who had been packing his house 3 days earlier was still frightened. Dane could see that. But fear was no longer making every decision for him. Dane lowered the phone. All right. Della looked at both of them. Congratulations. Dane frowned. For what? You two just avoided doing the stupidest thing available. That seems like a low standard. You'd be amazed. Della printed the filing data. The consent document had been notarized and submitted several months earlier. Otis looked at the date. His face changed again. No. Della glanced up. What? I wasn't here. Otis reached slowly for his wallet and removed a folded appointment card he had kept behind his veteran identification. The date matched. That morning, Otis had driven to a veterans medical center several hours from Ashwick Hollow for a scheduled evaluation. The appointment card showed the date and time. Otis remembered buying fuel on the return trip and believed the receipt might still be filed with his tax papers. Dane looked at the consent again. What time was this notarized? Della checked. Late morning. Otis tapped the appointment card. I was sitting in a waiting room 2 counties away. That did not prove everything. People signed documents earlier. Documents were sometimes notarized under specific procedures. Records could contain errors. Della said exactly that. No accusation. No leap. She simply began checking the notary information. The name was valid. The registration number matched a real commissioned notary. The seal format looked correct. Dane felt the question shift beneath his feet. A false-looking signature would have been simple. A completely invented notary would have been simpler still. But the person behind the seal existed. Della removed her glasses. If the seal was copied or misused, we have a problem. Otis waited. Della looked once more at the document. If the seal is genuine. She did not finish immediately. Dane looked at her. What? Della folded her glasses and set them beside the keyboard. Then, we may have a bigger one. Outside the archive room, Boone lifted his head when Otis came through the glass door. The shepherd stood and moved directly to him. Otis rested a hand on Boone's head. Not because the dog had found anything, because some discoveries left a man needing to touch something he knew was real. Behind them, Della carried the printed records in a plain brown folder. Miriam's old easement had answered one question. It had protected the creek. The newer document had opened another. Someone had put Otis Renner's name beneath a decision he said he had never made, and whoever had done it had not used a stranger's seal. Claire Sutton read the disputed consent document twice before she said anything. That alone made Dane Corbett impatient. They were sitting in a small conference room above a pharmacy in downtown Ashwick Hollow, where Claire kept a part-time legal office for older residents who needed help with property notices, benefits, contracts, and the kind of paperwork that became dangerous only after someone ignored it too long. At 61, Claire had silver-brown hair cut neatly to her jaw and gray-green eyes behind thin tortoiseshell reading glasses. She wore a cream turtleneck beneath a charcoal wool jacket. Nothing about her suggested hurry. Dane distrusted that immediately. Otis Renner sat beside him with both hands folded over the head of his cane, though he rarely used it unless snow made the sidewalks slick. Della Ames had brought the certified records she already had. Claire finally looked up. Who have you contacted at Northcrest? No one, Otis said. Claire looked at Dane. Dane understood why. I was going to. Claire removed her glasses. Don't. Dane leaned back. Otis has less than 3 weeks before foreclosure. Then we have even less time to do this wrong. The words were quiet. That made them harder to argue with. Dane tried anyway. If someone used his signature, asking the man benefiting from it seems reasonable. Reasonable is not the same as useful. Claire placed the document flat on the table. If you confront Gavin Kress now, you tell him exactly what we know, exactly what we don't know, and exactly where to start preparing an explanation. Dane's jaw tightened. Claire continued before he could answer. You can move faster than the system. Yes. And you can damage a case faster than the system. Della made a small mark in her notebook. Dane looked at her. You enjoying this? Deeply. Otis gave a dry cough that might have been laughter. Nobody won the argument. That helped. Claire gave them work instead. She wanted a certified copy of the owner consent directly from the county record, the original notary journal entry. Metadata showing when the document entered the permit file, every available version of North Crest's application, the transfer history of Otis's loan, and correspondence from Granite Crown Finance. Not theories, not accusations. Paper. Dane looked at the list. This is your version of moving fast? Claire slid the page toward him. This is my version of arriving somewhere with something still in our hands. Over the next 5 days, winter tightened around Ashwick Hollow. Snowbanks grew along the roads. Dane still repaired generators and heating equipment because other people's lives did not pause for Otis's foreclosure. In the evenings, he carried requested records between Claire, Della, and Otis. The calendar on Otis's refrigerator changed. 19 days became 18, then 17. Dane noticed every number. Otis stopped mentioning them. That worried him more. The first useful answer came from the notary journal. The seal on the consent document belonged to a real commissioned notary. The registration number matched. The journal also contained an entry under the name Otis Renner on the same date. At first, that seemed bad for Otis. Then Claire placed the journal copy beside North Crest's filed document. The journal entry described a financial document in broad language. No easement, no survey access, no North Crest parcel description. On the copy attached to the permit application, however, detailed property language appeared beneath the acknowledgement. Della leaned over it with her mechanical pencil. That section doesn't belong to the journal entry. Claire nodded. It may belong to the final document. That still doesn't tell us how it got there. Dane looked at the signature again. So we know it's wrong? Claire shook her head. We know Otis disputes the signature. We know his appointment records put him several hours away that day. We know the notary entry exists. We know the descriptions don't align cleanly. She folded her hands. That is enough to challenge authenticity. Not enough to say who did it. No. Dane disliked incomplete answers. Claire seemed to respect them. That afternoon, Dane drove Otis home before heading to repair a furnace on the north side of town. Boone rode in the back seat. They stopped outside the hardware store because Otis needed weather stripping. Across the street, an older woman was loading cardboard boxes into the bed of a faded green pickup. Boone noticed her before Dane did. The shepherd stood, tail giving one slow sweep against the seat. When Dane opened the door, Boone stepped out and walked directly toward her. The woman looked down. Well, look who still remembers decent people. Her name was May Talbot, a 75-year-old retired schoolteacher who had known Otis and Miriam for decades. She was a black woman with short silver curls, burgundy-framed glasses, and the upright posture of someone who had once quieted classrooms without raising her voice. Boone pressed his shoulder lightly against her leg. May rubbed the fur below his left ear. Miriam used to let you drag mud across my clean floor. Otis stopped beside the pickup. She blamed the dog. She blamed you. That sounds more like her. For a few seconds, the afternoon felt ordinary. Then Otis looked at the boxes. Moving something? May's hand stopped on Boone's neck. She looked at Otis's face. You selling too? Otis frowned. Selling what? May's eyes moved from Otis to Dane. The warmth left them. Never mind. She lifted another box. Otis did not let the moment pass. May. The retired teacher rested both hands on the cardboard. Around them, people moved in and out of the hardware store carrying salt, shovel handles, bags of birdseed. May lowered her voice. If they tell you you're the only person your age who can't keep up with the house anymore. She paused. The sentence seemed to cost her something. Don't believe that part. She closed the pickup tailgate. Then she left. Dane watched the truck disappear. Boone stayed beside Otis rather than following. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. It changed the investigation anyway. Claire checked May's property only after May gave permission. Her mortgage history was different from Otis's. No disputed owner consent form, no suspicious easement document. But Granite Crown Finance serviced her loan too. Then Della found a third property near the planned North Crest corridor that had entered Granite Crown's distressed loan portfolio before being sold by its owner, an 82-year-old man named Walter Keene. 3 older property owners, 3 parcels near the development, 1 company handling troubled loans. Dane stood at Claire's office window that evening while snow moved through the streetlights. That's a pattern. Claire sat behind her desk. It is a pattern. So now we know. No. Dane turned. Claire closed May's file. We know enough to ask a question 3 times. That is not the same as knowing the answer. Dane stared at her. You ever say anything the easy way? Yes. She pointed at the coffee beside him. That's mine. Dane looked down at the cup he had been drinking. He set it on her desk. Terrible coffee. You finished half. I've survived worse. Claire almost smiled. The brief humor did not last. Public corporate filings confirmed what Dane had already glimpsed days earlier. Granite Crown was not owned by Gavin Kress. The main private investment fund financing North Crest Lodge, however, held a controlling interest in Granite Crown. Granite Crown also bought distressed property loans across several states. Most had nothing to do with North Crest. That mattered. A legal corporate relationship was not proof that anyone had targeted Otis, May, or Walter. But around one development, 3 parcels belonging to people over 70 had entered the same company's portfolio. Otis listened to Claire explain it from the kitchen table. Boone lay nearby, chin on his paws. Otis stared at the loan statements. I should have said something sooner. Dane looked up. About what? The surveyors, the letters, the offers. You didn't know about May. That doesn't mean I didn't see what was happening to me. You saw bills? I saw pressure. Otis's voice remained quiet. That's different. Dane leaned back. You couldn't know it went beyond your property. Otis looked at him. Not knowing isn't the same as not seeing. The sentence opened a door Dane had kept closed for years. For 1 second, he remembered Micah Lane standing beside a half-repaired engine, sleeves rolled up, asking Dane a question Dane had answered with a joke. Nothing dramatic. That was what made the memory difficult. Some warnings arrived without alarms. Dane pushed it away. This was Otis's kitchen. Otis's problem. At least that was what he told himself. 2 days later, Claire called before sunrise. Dane was under a pickup replacing a frozen brake line when his phone vibrated across the garage floor. He answered with one glove still on. What happened? I found an older permit draft. Her voice had lost its usual measured calm. Not much. Enough. Dane slid out from beneath the truck. What's in it? Come see it. An hour later, Dane and Otis sat in Claire's office while Della joined them with her notebook. Claire laid 2 versions of the North Crest application side by side. The newer one contained Otis's disputed owner consent. The older draft had been prepared months earlier. Claire pointed to a paragraph in the Environmental and Access section. There it was. The Miriam Sloan Renner Conservation and Community Access Easement. Not vaguely. Not as a possible restriction. Northcrest's own draft identified the easement, named Ashwick Land Conservancy, and discussed the need for owner participation before any relocation process could begin. Dane checked the date, 3 months before the disputed consent was supposedly signed. So they knew, Claire nodded. They knew the easement existed. Otis stared at the 2 documents. The problem had changed again. Northcrest had not discovered an old restriction after beginning its plans. It had known about the restriction before the paper carrying Otis's disputed consent appeared. Dane placed one finger near the signature line. And this? Claire closed the folder. That part we still don't know. Outside the office, church bells marked the hour somewhere across Ashwick Hollow. Otis looked toward the sound, but said nothing. Faith, Dane had learned, did not always arrive as an answer. Sometimes, it was simply the strength to leave a question unanswered, long enough to keep from answering it wrong. 2 weeks after Dane Corbett paid $10 for Boone, Ashwick Hollow no longer felt like a village watching one old man lose a house. It felt like a village deciding what kind of future it wanted. The foreclosure deadline on Otis Renner's property had dropped to a handful of days. Snow now sat deep along Hollow Crest Road, and the old community hall was full before the evening meeting began. Dane stood near the back wall. Boone lay beside Otis's chair near the center aisle. That position mattered. Otis had refused the seat Claire Sutton suggested near the front. I can hear from here. Claire looked at him. That was not why I offered it. I know. The lawyer let the matter go. Dane noticed. He was learning there were different ways to respect a man. Sometimes one of them was not finishing the argument for him. The meeting had been called to discuss the North Crest Lodge development, but everybody in the room knew the Renner property had become part of the question. Some people had come because they supported Otis. Others had come because they supported the resort. Most had come because winter was long in Ashwick Hollow, and a job within 20 minutes of home meant something. Gavin Kress arrived without an entourage. At 55, he looked more like a regional bank executive than the villain Dane had prepared himself to dislike. Dark blonde hair silvered neatly at the temples, navy sport coat, gray trousers, polished waterproof boots with salt on the edges. Gavin shook hands with people he knew. He did not approach Otis. That restraint bothered Dane more than a performance would have. When Gavin spoke, he did not deny the dispute over the Renner parcel. He said the matter was under review, and North Crest would comply with whatever the proper authorities required. Then he talked about jobs, construction crews, maintenance positions, food service, winter tourism, contracts for local electricians, plumbers, snow removal crews, and supply businesses. He talked about county tax revenue that could support roads and emergency services. Nothing he said was obviously false. That was the problem. A man near the front stood and explained that his son drove nearly 2 hours each way for steady work. My boy wants to stay here, he said. There just isn't enough here to stay for. A woman who ran a small bakery said winter months had become harder every year. Another resident asked whether environmental safeguards could be preserved while North Crest moved forward. The room did not divide cleanly into good people and bad ones. Dane had seen easier conflicts. He trusted those less. Then a hardware store owner named Carl Morrow stood. Carl was not cruel. Dane had fixed his delivery truck twice. He looked directly at Otis. We all respect what you've done for this town. The room grew quieter. Carl continued. But are we protecting one man's property rights, or are we asking the whole town to pay for them? Boone lifted his head. Otis did not move. Dane felt anger rise fast and hot. He could have answered. He did not. The agreement from Otis's kitchen still mattered. Your house. Your decision. Otis rested one hand on Boone's shoulder. The German shepherd stayed down. For the rest of the meeting, Otis said almost nothing. That frightened Dane more than anger would have. Outside, after the crowd began separating into small groups under the snowy streetlights, Otis stopped beside Dane. Maybe Carl has a point. Dane looked at him. He has an interest. So do I. That doesn't make your rights worth less. Otis watched families crossing the parking lot. It doesn't make theirs worth less either. Dane had no clean answer. Northcrest could bring jobs. The clinic road mattered. Otis's house mattered. May Talbot's house mattered. A town could be right in several directions and still hurt itself, choosing only one. Across the lot, May approached Claire carrying a thick white envelope. Boone recognized her and rose. May bent to scratch beneath his collar. At least one male in this town remembers how to greet a lady. Otis looked at Dane. Dane said, "She's probably not talking about me." May straightened. Good. Self-awareness is a blessing. The humor softened the moment just enough. Then May handed the envelope to Claire. These came from Granite Crown. Inside were letters sent over several months. The language was careful, professional, polite. One sentence appeared in slightly different forms more than once. Continued ownership may become an unnecessary burden at this stage of life. Claire read it twice. Nothing in the sentence was illegal. That almost made it worse. Otis had received letters with similar language, not identical. Similar enough. Age was never called incapacity directly. It was simply placed beside words like burden, transition, simplify, and relief until selling a house began to sound less like losing something and more like accepting sensible advice. May folded her arms. I taught 7th grade for 31 years. Claire looked up. May's voice stayed level. I know when somebody is trying to choose the answer before asking the question. That line stayed with Dane. The next morning, Claire contacted Walter Keene, the 82-year-old former owner of the third parcel near Northcrest. Walter now lived with his daughter outside Ashwick Hollow. He did not claim anyone had forged his signature. He did not remember every figure in the settlement either. What he remembered was simpler. He had believed selling would clear everything. Later, several servicing and legal charges were deducted from the settlement amount. Walter had signed documents. He simply was not sure he had understood the final balance the same way the company had explained it afterward. Claire treated that uncertainty carefully. Walter was not proof. Neither was May. Neither was Otis by himself. But 3 older property owners had encountered different versions of the same pressure around the same development corridor. That created a larger question. How did you protect an older person without turning age itself into the reason nobody believed him? By evening, Dane understood why that question bothered him personally. Gavin Kress and Dane Corbett were not alike in purpose. Gavin wanted control of land that made his project cheaper. Dane had wanted to protect Otis. But at Otis's kitchen table, both men had started from the same sentence without saying it aloud. I know what is best for you. One used it for business. The other had used it for kindness. A man could lose choice either way. That night, Dane found Otis in the garage. Several tool drawers stood open. 2 cardboard boxes sat on the workbench. Otis was wrapping old sockets in newspaper. Boone lay near the wood stove. Dane leaned against the doorframe. Packing again. Otis kept working. Never stopped. Dane looked at the boxes. Meeting got to you. Otis folded newspaper around a wrench. The meeting reminded me I don't own the town. No one said you did. No. They said I might be standing in its way. Dane stepped farther inside. Otis finally stopped. The house isn't what scares me most. He looked toward the shelves, the old tools, the place where his hands had known what to do for decades. What scares me is becoming a problem everybody solves. Dane said nothing. Otis continued. One doctor says don't climb ladders. Somebody decides I shouldn't fix my own roof. One bank says simplify. Somebody decides I shouldn't own a house. Pretty soon everybody is being kind to me, and I'm nowhere in the conversation. Boone rose and moved closer to Otis's chair. The old man rested his fingers on the dog's neck. Dane understood more than he wanted to. For years, he had confused being needed with being close to people. It was easier to repair a generator than promise to come back next week. Easier to carry weight than admit somebody else might need to carry part of his. Otis looked at him. You ever plan on staying anywhere? The question caught Dane off guard. He gave the answer he always gave. Depends. Otis waited. The old excuse sounded thin in the garage. Dane looked down at the small steel feeler gauge in his hand. The initials on the worn casing were nearly smooth. ML. Micah Lane, Dane said. Otis said nothing. So Dane continued. Best friend I had in the service. The story came out without ceremony. Dane and Micah had talked for years about opening a garage after leaving the Navy. They never chose a town, never agreed on a name. Micah wanted a big sign. Dane said signs were wasted money. They argued about lifts, tool brands, whether customers should get free coffee. It had been an ordinary promise. Then Micah never came home. Dane had. After that, promises about the future felt like writing checks against an account God had already shown could close without warning. I stopped making plans that needed another Thursday, Dane said. Otis looked at the feeler gauge. His? Dane nodded. Otis returned to wrapping the wrench. After a while, he said, Some promises aren't kept in one day. Dane looked at him. How are they kept? Otis slid the wrench into the box. By coming back. Nothing more. No lesson explained. No forgiveness offered. Boone lowered his head onto Otis's boot. The next afternoon, Claire called them back to Della Ames's records table. She and Della had been comparing older North Crest route studies. Della spread 2 maps beneath the overhead lamp. There were always 2 options. One service road crossed the upper Renner parcel. The second stayed west. It did not touch Otis's land. Dane traced the western line. Why did it disappear? Della pointed to a narrow ravine. Bridge. The terrain required a small engineered crossing and additional rockwork. Claire had found the cost comparison. The western alternative remained physically possible. It was simply much more expensive. Otis stared at the map. So they don't need my property. Della shook her head. They do. She tapped the cheaper route. To keep the project at the cost they want. The distinction was small in words, not in meaning. North Crest had not been choosing between a resort and no resort. It had been choosing between a more expensive road and a cheaper road through land Otis controlled. Dane looked at Otis. The old man's face did not brighten. If anything, he looked more tired, because now the argument had become clearer. His house was not standing between Ashwick Hollow and a future. It was standing between a developer and the least expensive version of that future. Claire checked the foreclosure calendar. 72 hours. Otis folded the map. No one needed to ask what she meant. 3 days. Outside, Boone waited beside the truck while snow began falling again over Ashwick Hollow. The town still did not want the same thing. And now, with 72 hours left, Otis finally knew what his refusal was actually costing North Crest. The next question was what North Crest would offer to make him stop refusing. 72 hours could feel like a long time when a man was waiting for weather. It felt much shorter when he was waiting to find out whether he would still own his home. By Friday morning, Claire Sutton had filed the request for a temporary foreclosure stay. The filing challenged the authenticity of the owner consent document, pointed to the pending land use review, and raised questions about several servicing charges in Otis Renner's loan history. None of that guaranteed anything. The county planning office had paused the next step of North Crest's road permit. while the easement issue was reviewed. Ashwick Land Conservancy had confirmed that it had never approved relocation of the protected creek corridor. Still, Otis's foreclosure clock had not stopped. Not yet. Dane Corbett understood deadlines. He had lived much of his adult life around clocks that mattered. This one bothered him differently. There was no task he could finish with a wrench, no engine to repair before midnight, no road to clear before snow buried it. He could only wait while other people decided whether the paperwork was enough to buy Otis more time. That made him restless. So he did what he always did when restlessness threatened to become control. He worked. By noon, Dane had repaired a plow motor, replaced a cracked generator belt, and driven back to Otis's property to check the garage heater. Boone followed him from the truck to the porch. The German Shepherd had resumed his old routines almost completely. He checked the yard after breakfast. He slept near Otis's chair. He watched Dane work without interfering. The only thing that had changed was that Boone now treated Dane's arrival as expected. Dane noticed. He did not name what that meant. Inside the house, several moving boxes were still stacked against the wall. Otis had not unpacked them. He had not added new ones either. That seemed to be the shape of hope now. Not celebration. Just the decision not to carry another box downstairs. A dark SUV appeared shortly after 2. Dane recognized it before it stopped. Northcrest. Boone lifted his head from the rug. Otis looked through the window. He's coming himself. Dane set down the screwdriver in his hand. Gavin Kress stepped from the SUV carrying a slim leather folder. No survey crew, no lawyer, no photographer. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a dark blue sweater, and snow caught briefly in his silvering hair before he reached the porch. Otis opened the door before Gavin knocked. That mattered too. Gavin was entering because Otis allowed it, not because anybody had decided the room belonged to him. They sat at the kitchen table. Dane took the chair nearest the wall. Boone lay beside the wood stove. Gavin placed the folder on the table, but did not open it immediately. I know Claire Sutton filed for a stay. Otis gave no reaction. Gavin continued. I also know the county has paused the current road application. Dane watched him. There was no anger in Gavin's voice. If anything, he sounded tired. That made what came next more dangerous, not less. I'm not here to argue those filings, Gavin said. They'll go where they go. He opened the folder. Inside was a purchase offer. Otis read the first page, then the second. His expression changed. Dane noticed before he saw the number. This was not the low offer Northcrest had made months earlier. The new proposal would satisfy the outstanding debt, cover Otis's moving costs, provide enough money to purchase a smaller house in or near Ashwick Hollow, and leave a substantial remainder. Boone would not have to go anywhere Otis did not choose. Neither would Otis. At least that was how the offer was written. Dane felt his stomach tighten. Gavin had finally brought something a reasonable man might accept. That was far harder to fight than an insult. Otis kept reading. Gavin explained the rest without dressing it up. Northcrest wanted control of the upper portion of the parcel because it provided the cheaper road approach. Buying the property would not erase Miriam's conservation easement. Gavin said so directly. But ownership would give Northcrest control over the unprotected upper land and the legal standing to formally request an easement relocation process with the Conservancy and county. The outcome would still require approvals. Nothing was guaranteed. But Northcrest would be in a much stronger position. Dane appreciated the honesty almost against his will. Gavin folded his hands. I don't need you to like me, Otis. Otis looked over the top of the contract. Good. A faint smile touched Gavin's face, then disappeared. I need you to understand something else. He glanced toward the moving boxes. Winning a dispute is not the same as winning old age. The room went still. Dane's eyes hardened. Gavin did not look at him. He kept his attention on Otis. You can spend the next year in hearings, reviews, motions, appointments, people asking you to prove what you remember and what you signed and what you understood. Or you can leave this table with no debt, a home you choose, and enough money to stop worrying about whether the furnace survives another winter. The offer sat between them. So did the truth inside it. Otis was tired. Dane could see that now. Not defeated. Tired. There was a difference. A man could fight something because he believed it was wrong, and still wish somebody would give him permission to stop. For the first time, Dane wondered whether Gavin understood that better than any of them. Otis looked at the boxes along the wall. He looked through the window toward the garage, then toward Boone. Dane knew what the older man was counting. If Otis signed, Claire could stop chasing documents. May Talbot would no longer have to speak publicly because of him. The town meeting arguments could move on. There would be money. There would be another house. Boone would still have a bed near Otis. And perhaps, somewhere in that list, Otis could tell himself that leaving had become his choice after all. Gavin placed a black fountain pen beside the contract. Dane stared at it. "Don't sign." The words were out before he could stop them. Otis turned his head. Dane felt the mistake immediately, not because he believed the opposite, because the sentence belonged to the same habit he had been trying to break. Decide quickly. Protect first. Explain later. Dane lowered his eyes. "Sorry." Otis waited. Dane forced himself to ask the harder question. "What do you want me to do?" Otis looked at the empty chair beside him. "Sit." So Dane sat and said nothing else. Gavin's phone vibrated. He checked the screen. "I need to take this." He stepped into the front room, leaving the folder open on the kitchen table. Otis picked up the fountain pen. The movement was small. It changed everything. Dane did not speak. Boone had been lying beside the wood stove. The shepherd raised his head. For several seconds, he only watched Otis. Then Boone stood. He walked across the kitchen. No urgency, no growl, no special signal. He stopped beside Otis's chair and pushed his head gently beneath the old man's free hand. The same movement he had made the morning Dane brought him home. Otis's fingers settled into the fur behind Boone's ear. The pen remained in his other hand. Dane saw Otis look at the dog, then at the contract. Something passed across the old man's face. Not revelation. Recognition. 2 weeks earlier, Otis had tied Boone's future to someone else because he was afraid the dog would lose a home. He had acted early, before the worst thing happened. Before Boone could be taken by circumstances Otis could not control. He had called it protection. Now a contract sat in front of him, offering another version of the same relief. Leave first. Lose the thing on your own terms. Make fear look like planning. Otis put the fountain pen down. Boone stayed beneath his hand. When Gavin returned, Otis slid the contract across the table. Gavin looked at the unsigned signature line. Then at Otis. "I sold a member of my family because I was afraid you'd take this house from me." Gavin's eyes moved briefly toward Boone. Otis continued. "I thought if I gave him up first, at least I'd get to call it a choice." The room held the words. Otis rested his palm against Boone's head. "I'm not selling the house for the same reason." Gavin did not argue. For a moment, he looked less like a developer and more like a man who knew an offer had reached the end of its usefulness. He put the fountain pen back into his coat. "I hope you're right." Otis's expression tightened. "About what?" Gavin closed the folder. "That people in this town remember your dignity longer than they remember the jobs the cheaper road might have brought." It was not a threat. That made it harder. Gavin stood, thanked Otis for hearing him out, and left. The SUV disappeared through falling snow. Only then did Dane breathe properly. Otis remained at the kitchen table. The house was still under foreclosure. The stay had not been granted. North Crest still had lawyers. Granite Crown still held the loan. Nothing had become safe because Otis had said no. That was why the decision mattered. He had chosen without knowing whether courage would be rewarded. Sometimes faith looked like that, not certainty. A hand leaving the pen on the table before God showed a man what came next. The phone rang 11 minutes later. Otis stared at it. Dane did not move. The older man answered. Claire's voice carried faintly through the room. When Otis hung up, he sat without speaking. Dane waited. Finally, Otis said, "Temporary stay." The words seemed almost too small. Dane leaned forward. For how long? Long enough to review the disputed consent and servicing record. Not victory. Time. For now, time was enough. Over the next several days, the consequences separated into the hands of the institutions actually responsible for them. The County Planning Authority formally suspended further processing of the road route that relied on Otis's disputed participation. Ashwick Land Conservancy confirmed in writing that it had never approved relocation of Miriam's easement. A consumer finance regulator opened a review of Granite Crown's servicing practices. Otis's account, May Talbot's loan, and Walter Keene's former settlement would each be examined on their own facts. No one declared 3 identical victims. There were not 3 identical cases. The irregular consent document went to the proper authorities for further examination of how the signature and notary information had been used. Claire made sure everyone understood the difference. Questions were now official. Answers were not. North Crest Lodge itself was not canceled. The development could still move forward, but the company could no longer rely on the cheaper road through Otis's parcel as though his consent were settled. North Crest would have to return to the more expensive western route, or propose something new that respected the existing easement and the approval process. Ashwick Hollow had not defeated a resort. It had simply made the resort pay the real price of building without taking somebody else's choice as a discount. Late that evening, Dane and Otis stood in the garage. Snow tapped softly against the metal door. Boone slept near the workbench. Otis was unpacking one of the boxes he had sealed weeks earlier. Not all of them. 1. He removed a set of sockets and placed them back in their drawer. Dane watched. Otis glanced over. "You didn't save my house." Dane said nothing. A month earlier, the words might have offended him. Now he understood them as something else. Otis closed the drawer. "You helped me keep enough room to save it myself." Dane looked toward Boone. The German Shepherd opened one amber hazel eye, decided no one required supervision, and closed it again. Dane smiled. Small. Real. "Think you're going to unpack the rest?" Otis looked at the remaining boxes. "Let's not make promises we can't keep." Dane laughed once. This time, the joke did not feel like a way out. By the time February settled over Ashwick Hollow, winter had stopped feeling temporary. Snow filled the shoulders of Hollow Crest Road and climbed halfway up fence posts. Roofs carried white weight. Pines bent quietly under it. But the road remained open. On most mornings, a county plow passed before sunrise. Later, delivery trucks followed. So did the small vehicles from Ashwick Community Clinic. The retaining wall behind Otis Renner's property now appeared on a county inspection schedule, not as a reward, not as repayment for what Otis had spent years earlier. The county had simply acknowledged what had become clear during the review. Part of that structure protected a public road, and maintenance affecting that public function should not rest entirely on one aging homeowner. Otis accepted the arrangement after reading every page twice. Claire Sutton had offered to read it with him. He let her. Then he signed his own name. North Crest Lodge had not disappeared either. The development was redesigned around the more expensive Western Service route, the one that required a small bridge across the ravine. Construction would cost more. The timeline stretched. Some residents still resented that. Carl Morrow, the hardware store owner who had questioned Otis at the community meeting, remained polite but unconvinced. Others worried that higher costs meant fewer local contracts. No grand apology followed. Ashwick Hollow did not become a town where everybody suddenly agreed. It became something slightly better, a town where disagreement no longer erased ownership. Granite Crown Finance's review also produced narrower results than gossip had predicted. Some servicing charges on Otis's account were adjusted. Others remained valid. May Talbot's loan required its own corrections. Walter Keene's former settlement was reviewed separately, and several fees were reconsidered after the documentation failed to match what had originally been explained to him. No one announced a sweeping conspiracy. No one needed to. Enough had been wrong that ordinary people began asking better questions before signing the next paper. For Otis, the remaining legitimate debt was refinanced through a local credit union at a fixed payment he could manage on his pension. He still owed money. That was important to him. "I'm not looking for a free house," he told Dane one morning. Dane was replacing a worn latch on the garage cabinet. "I know." Otis watched him tighten the screw. "You saying that because you agree, or because Claire trained you?" Dane kept working. "Both." Otis nodded. "Good lawyer." "Terrible coffee." From the doorway, Boone lifted his head. The German Shepherd had learned that human conversations involving coffee rarely required intervention. The Ashwick Home Steward Fund came together slowly after that. It wasn't a charity that bought houses for people. That idea had been rejected almost immediately. Instead, local donations created a modest guarantee fund that could help qualified older homeowners refinance, pay for an inspection, obtain contract review, or cover an urgent repair before a small problem became an expensive one. Otis had insisted on one condition. Nobody was to be described as a case before somebody asked what they actually wanted. That principle became the first rule of the Open Door Circle, a monthly gathering held in the community room beside the fire station. The first meeting drew 9 people. The second drew 14. Some brought loan notices. Some brought deeds. One man brought a furnace estimate and admitted after 10 minutes that he had really come because he did not understand the letter attached to it. May attended once a month and brought cookies nobody was allowed to compliment too much. Della Ames helped people locate old records. Claire kept scheduled office hours. Walter agreed to let his documents be reviewed, but refused every suggestion that his name be placed on a flyer. "I was confused about a settlement," he said. "I did not become a monument." Nobody argued. Dane handled the things with screws, wires, belts, switches, and rust. That part suited him. A heater one week, a snowblower the next, a generator that turned out to need nothing more dramatic than a corroded terminal, and an owner willing to stop hitting it with a wrench. Dane repaired the terminal. He confiscated the wrench for 10 minutes. Life in Ashwick Hollow began doing what life usually did after a crisis. It stopped announcing itself. Otis reopened one bench in his garage on Thursday afternoons. Not as a business, not exactly. He repaired small engines for neighbors who could wait. Sharpened mower blades no one needed until spring. Cleaned carburetors. Rewired old lamps when somebody insisted the lamp had sentimental value, which Otis claimed was the most expensive kind. The work gave his hands somewhere useful to go. Boone usually slept near the bench, and Dane started coming on Thursdays. At first he had reasons. The garage door track needed adjusting. A generator had to be tested under load. Someone had dropped off a snowblower with a fuel problem. A week later, Dane brought a carburetor that did not belong to any machine Otis recognized. Otis turned it over in his hand. "What's this off?" Dane was hanging his coat. "Engine." Otis looked at him. "I gathered that. Small engine. What kind?" Dane took longer than necessary to answer. Otis set the carburetor down. "Thought so." He never asked why Dane had really come. That was another kind of kindness. Weeks passed. Thursday became less of a visit and more of a shape in the week. Dane still repaired equipment across the village. He still lived alone beside his own garage. He still did not suddenly become a man who loved schedules. But sometime after 5 on Thursdays, Boone began listening for his truck. Dane noticed that too. One afternoon, Otis was sorting old drawer handles when he placed Boone's brown leather leash on the workbench. Dane looked at it. "What?" Otis kept his eyes on the drawer. "You could keep him." The sentence landed quietly. Dane did not answer at once. Months earlier, he would have decided what Otis meant before asking. Now he looked at the old man. "Is that what you want?" Otis rested both hands on the edge of the bench. "I want Boone to have both of us." Dane glanced toward the German shepherd. Boone was lying near the stove, eyes open. Otis continued. "I sold him once, because I thought love meant choosing where he should be, without asking what he already knew." The old man touched the leash. "I'm trying not to repeat myself." Dane understood. Neither man called Boone. They left the leash on the table. For several seconds, the shepherd remained where he was. Then Boone stood. He walked first to Dane. The black and tan dog stopped between Dane's boots and pressed his forehead into Dane's open palm. Dane's fingers closed lightly against the fur behind the left ear that tilted outward when Boone relaxed. Boone stayed there only a few seconds. Then he turned. He crossed the garage and lay down beside Otis's chair. Otis looked at Dane. Dane looked back. Neither man tried to translate the dog into a speech. There was nothing to improve. Boone had not chosen one man against the other. He had simply gone where affection led him, then returned where home had always been. The leash stayed on the workbench. By late February, Open Door Circle had helped 3 people obtain contract reviews before signing anything. 2 homeowners find affordable repairs, and 1 widow discovered that the frightening letter from her lender required a phone call, not a moving truck. The work was small. That was why Dane trusted it. No ceremony. No headlines. People came through the door with a question and left with one less. Maybe God did some of his best work that way. Not always with a road opening or a courtroom ruling. Sometimes with a chair pulled out before somebody had to ask whether they were welcome. On the last Thursday of the month, snow began falling shortly before dark. Inside Otis's garage, the wood stove clicked softly. Dane sat at the workbench with the same questionable carburetor he had been repairing for several visits. Otis poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. Boone lay between them beside a steel water bowl. Through the garage window, headlights moved along Hollow Crest Road below the retaining wall. A vehicle from Ashwick Community Clinic passed slowly through the bend, tires following the dark tracks left by the county plow. Otis watched it disappear behind the trees. Then he looked at the wall clock. 6:23. "You staying late?" Dane turned a brass adjustment screw a quarter turn. "Complex repair." Otis leaned over the carburetor. "You cleaned that same jet last Thursday." Dane looked at him. "Quality control." "Uh-huh." Otis set 1 mug beside Dane. The coffee smelled stronger than necessary. Dane took a sip. His face tightened. Otis saw it. "Says something." "Possibly several things. Drink slower." "That won't help." Boone opened one eye. The old man smiled and sat down. For a while, the only sounds were the stove, the soft wind against the garage door, and Dane unnecessarily adjusting a part that had been finished a week earlier. Then Otis checked the clock again. "Next Thursday?" A simple question. Dane's hand stopped. There had been a time when he would have answered the way he always did. "I'll see what I can do." Leave the future open. Never promise the next Thursday. Never write a check against something life might take away. Dane looked at the worn steel feeler gauge beside his hand. The initials ML were almost smooth now. Micah had not come back. That truth had not changed. But Dane had. He put the tool down. Around 6, Otis nodded toward the mug. "Coffee. Don't make it early." Otis frowned. "Why?" "Yours is bad fresh. No reason to find out what happens with age." Otis pointed toward the garage door. "Then don't come." Dane looked down. Boone had shifted closer, one paw resting near Dane's boot and his back against Otis's chair. Dane smiled. "Still coming. Sometimes love does not ask us to take control. It asks us to stay close enough that someone does not have to face a hard choice alone." Otis needed help, but he also needed the dignity to choose his own road. And Dane learned that loyalty is not always about fixing what is broken. Sometimes it is simply about coming back. Maybe that is one of the quiet ways God works in our lives, not by removing every struggle, but by sending people who will stand beside us while we find the courage to take the next step ourselves. If this story spoke to you, tell us what it meant to you in the comments, and subscribe if you would like to stay with us for more stories like this. May God give you peace, good people beside you, and the strength to keep your own voice when life gets difficult.